Secretary of Defense mocked a simple clerk, but she unmasked herself as a soldier and made him kneel. The story begins in the Grand Hall of Power, where cameras flashed and officials sat in rigid rows, waiting for the words of a man who believed himself untouchable. Richard Alden, the Secretary of Defense, stood tall, his arrogance woven into every syllable of his speech. To him, power was a performance, and the audience was always ready to applaud. But in the corner of the hall, nearly invisible, stood a young woman holding a small stack of files. She appeared ordinary, too ordinary to matter, and that was precisely his mistake. What began as laughter soon turned into a storm. The powerful man mocked her, reducing her to nothing more than a shadow, a symbol of weakness in a hall built for strength. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was patience, and patience in the right hands can shake the ground beneath even the highest authority. If you want more gripping stories where arrogance collapses and justice rises, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because on this day, in this hall, the mighty would fall, and the clerk no one noticed would become the soldier who silenced them all. The grand hall glimmered with polished marble floors and banners heavy with military insignias, a place designed to project authority. Journalists whispered among themselves, scribbling notes as high-ranking officials filled the front rows. At the center stood Richard Alden, the Secretary of Defense, adjusting his cufflinks with theatrical precision. His smile was sharp, his tone commanding, and the room bent to his presence. Yet at the far edge of the hall, barely noticed, a young woman shuffled in quietly, holding a small stack of files. Her plain clothes and lowered gaze marked her as nothing more than a clerk, invisible in the shadows of towering power. Richard's voice boomed as he leaned on the podium. He thrived on control, relishing the silence he commanded with every pause. Power, he declared, is not granted. It is seized by those who dare to lead. Applause erupted, though hollow. His eyes, scanning the room for weakness to exploit, fell upon the young clerk fumbling with her papers. A smirk spread across his lips. The audience turned instinctively toward his gaze, waiting for the show. Richard had found his next victim. He stepped down from the podium with deliberate slowness, his polished shoes striking against marble like a drumbeat of intimidation. "Tell me," he said loudly enough for the press to catch every word, "what is it you do here? A clerk, is it? Filing papers for real men." Laughter rippled through the hall, a cruel chorus amplifying his mockery. The woman froze but kept her eyes lowered. The camera zoomed in on her face, expecting shame, expecting collapse. But the faintest trace of defiance flickered in her jawline, unseen by most, except Richard, who misread it as fear. The hall thickened with unease as Richard circled her like a predator. "Stand up straight," he barked, pointing a finger close enough to touch her. She rose to her feet, her small frame swallowed by the crowd of uniforms and medals. "Useless," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "Do you even know the weight of the documents you carry? Or are you simply here to remind us that weakness still exists within these walls?" The audience chuckled again, feeding his ego, but the woman's silence held a strange gravity that unsettled the moment. General Marcus Hale shifted in his seat, his stern expression betraying a trace of discomfort. He had seen soldiers crumble under less pressure, yet this clerk did not move. Richard, sensing the hesitation of the room, pressed harder. "Answer me," he demanded, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. She remained silent, clutching the files to her chest, her posture firm, her eyes downcast. It was a silence that was not submission, but resistance. Richard mistook it for cowardice and sneered, enjoying the spectacle. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as though history were being made. The story was perfect. A powerful secretary humiliating a fragile assistant. But something in the air resisted the narrative. The young woman's stillness seemed almost rehearsed, too deliberate for chance. Some in the audience whispered, uneasy. Was she trembling or calculating? Richard's smirk grew wider, blind to the shift in tension, certain that his authority was absolute. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper meant to sting. "People like you are forgettable," he said, "shadows that exist only to be dismissed by men like me." But as the words cut through the air, the clerk's grip on the files tightened. Her knuckles whitened, her shoulders squared ever so slightly. It was subtle, invisible to most, but to those watching closely, it was as if the balance of power in the room trembled for a second. Richard failed to notice, drunk on his own performance. The hall erupted again in forced laughter as Richard turned back to the crowd, raising his hands as though commanding an orchestra. "This," he gestured toward her, "is why our nation must remain vigilant. Weakness breeds complacency." The audience clapped, though not all with conviction. A few eyes lingered on Clerk, curious now. Why did she endure such humiliation without breaking? Why did she not flee? She seemed to be waiting for something. Richard returned his gaze to her, expecting tears or submission. Instead, her expression remained unreadable, a mask of calm restraint. It was not defiance, not fear, but something far more dangerous. Patience. The kind of patience that unnerves tyrants when they sense it too late. Richard's confidence swelled, but in the corners of the hall, doubt began to grow. If this woman was truly so powerless, why did her silence feel like a storm waiting to break? The applause faded into scattered whispers as Richard returned to the podium, clearly pleased with himself. Yet his eyes kept darting back to young Clerk as though she were unfinished business. Elena stood in silence, holding the files tightly, her expression composed. To the room, it looked like compliance. To Richard, it was confirmation of his dominance. But behind that stillness, her mind sharpened like a blade, measuring every word, every movement, waiting for a precise moment to strike. Richard raised his hand dramatically, commanding attention once more. "You see," he announced, "the strength of a nation is reflected in those who serve it with honor and discipline." And then his eyes cut toward Elena. "There are those who slip in through cracks, adding nothing, contributing nothing. Dead weight." Laughter followed again, though some in the audience winced. Elena's lips tightened, but she neither flinched nor lowered her gaze further. Her silence began to feel less like weakness and more like a shield. General Hale noticed it first. His years in service had trained him to read body language as clearly as maps. Something about this young woman's posture was wrong for a clerk. Shoulders squared, feet planted, weight evenly distributed, like a soldier standing at ease. He frowned, though he said nothing, unwilling to challenge Richard in public. But the seed of doubt was planted, and Hale's eyes returned to her again and again, searching for cracks in her disguise. Richard, oblivious of the unease in the hall, pressed harder. "Tell me, Clerk," he jeered, "do you believe you could ever stand among those who protect this nation? Or are you content to shuffle papers until someone stronger decides your worth?" His words sliced through the silence, each syllable designed to break her composure. But Elena remained motionless, her chest rising and falling steadily. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Why didn't she react? Why didn't she run? Her stillness was beginning to erode Richard's illusion of total control. Journalists leaned forward, sensing the tension shifting. They wanted tears, confrontation, collapse, anything to cement Richard's dominance. Instead, they found something unexpected: restraint. The cameras lingered on Elena's face, capturing her unwavering calm, her eyes glinting with something unspoken. The spectacle Richard thought he was orchestrating was starting to slip from his hands. He was mocking her, yes, but in her silence, she was mocking him back. Richard slammed his fist against the podium, frustrated by her lack of response. "Answer me," he roared, his voice echoing like gunfire. A few gasps rippled through the hall at his sudden outburst. Elena slowly lifted her head, her gaze locking with his for the first time. The connection was brief, but in that instant the room shifted. Richard's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat. Her eyes were steady, unshaken, and there was something in them that unsettled him. Authority, perhaps, or judgment. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on everyone present. For the first time, Richard seemed unsure, though he quickly masked it with scoff. "Pathetic," he muttered, retreating to the podium. Yet the audience had seen the hesitation, fleeting as it was. Whispers spread. Who was this woman, and why did she not crumble? Even those who had laughed moments earlier now exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that Richard's power was not as absolute as he believed. Elena lowered her gaze again, but the damage was done. The brief clash of eyes had shifted the balance, planting doubt in the minds of all who witnessed it. Her silence was no longer interpreted as fear. It was strategy. And though Richard continued to speak, louder and more aggressive, the weight of the hall no longer leaned entirely in his favor. Something was building beneath the surface, and everyone could feel it. The question was no longer if she would break, but when she would reveal the truth hidden beneath her quiet resolve. Richard, sensing that the whispers in the hall were weakening his grip, decided subtle mockery was no longer enough. He slammed his hand against the podium once more and pointed at Elena with a theatrical sneer. If you are so determined to stand there in silence, then prove your worth. Serve the men in this hall. Coffee, water, something useful at last. His words rang like a gavel, echoing through the chamber. The audience stiffened. It was no longer a joke. He had issued a command meant to humiliate beyond repair. Elena did not move. The files remained pressed firmly to her chest, her body frozen yet deliberate, as if rooted to the ground. Richard waited, expecting a scramble to obey, a flustered attempt to please him. Instead, the stillness stretched into an uncomfortable silence. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every second. What was meant to be a scene of domination was turning into something else, a spectacle of defiance cloaked in quiet composure. Richard's lips curled in irritation. General Hale shifted again, this time more noticeably. His trained eyes scanned Elena from head to toe. Her stance was unmistakable. No civilian held themselves like that under pressure. Shoulders back, feet planted shoulder-width apart, chin steady. She looked like someone prepared for inspection, not ridicule. Hale's brow furrowed, unease creeping into his chest. He whispered something to the officer beside him, who nodded slowly. Doubt was spreading like wildfire among those who should have been Richard's loyal witnesses. Richard, blind to the tide turning against him, pressed further. "Go on then," he shouted, voice sharp and commanding. "Show this room that you know your place." Laughter bubbled again, but weaker this time, hesitant. Elena slowly raised her head, her eyes locking on Richard once more. The room hushed instantly. She didn't speak, but her gaze cut through the air sharper than any blade. Richard faltered, swallowing hard before covering it with another mocking grin. The shift was small but undeniable. For the journalists, it was the moment they had been waiting for. The fracture in the story. The Secretary of Defense was supposed to be untouchable, yet here he was, visibly shaken by the silence of a supposed clerk. Cameras flashed like lightning, reporters scribbling headlines before the moment had even ended. Elena had not moved a muscle, but the power dynamic had begun to shift. The crowd felt it, a subtle current in the air, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Richard, cornered by the weight of his own arrogance, tried to double down. He stepped off the podium and stood inches from Elena, his voice a low growl. "Obey, or leave this hall in disgrace." His breath was hot, his authority dripping with venom. But Elena neither stepped forward nor retreated. Instead, her grip on the files tightened, her thumb brushing over the edge where a hidden emblem glimmered faintly. Most missed it, but a handful of sharp eyes in the audience gasped softly, sensing the truth just beyond reach. The silence stretched again, unbearable now. Elena's refusal to comply was no longer passive. It was active resistance. Richard leaned closer, whispering with venom meant only for her. "Do you know who I am? I could end your career before it begins." For the first time, Elena's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. The expression was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of inevitability. It was a smile of someone who knew the endgame had already been written. The hall pulsed with tension, every pair of eyes fixed on the strange duel unfolding between power and patience. Richard's voice may have filled the room, but his control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Elena remained unshaken, and in her silence, she had taken command of the hall, without uttering a single word. The audience, once complicit in her humiliation, now leaned forward in anticipation. Something was coming, something that would shatter the illusion of Richard's dominance forever. The silence had grown unbearable, stretching like a taut wire ready to snap. Richard's voice, once booming and confident, now sounded strained as he demanded obedience again. "Clerk," he barked, his face inches from hers. But before he could say more, Elena raised her head fully, her eyes sharp and steady. For the first time, her voice rang out, calm yet commanding. "That's enough, sir." The words were not loud, but the authority in them cut through the air like a blade. The entire hall froze. Gasps rippled across the audience. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Her tone didn't belong to a secretary or clerk. It belonged to someone used to giving orders, not taking them. Richard blinked, taken aback, his mouth opening and closing without sound. For the first time that evening, he had lost his script. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment history bent on a single phrase. Elena slowly shifted the files in her hands, sliding a thumb under the stack until a hidden badge glinted in the light. She held it up, steady, the emblem of rank shining unmistakably. Murmurs erupted across the hall, disbelief spreading like fire. This was no clerk. This was a soldier. Richard stumbled back a step, his smirk collapsing under the weight of recognition. "Impossible," he muttered, but the evidence shone too brightly to deny. The atmosphere shifted violently. Journalists scrambled to capture the revelation, pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing nonstop. Officials who had laughed minutes earlier now sat stone-faced, realizing the tide was turning. General Hale leaned forward, his jaw tightening. He had suspected something was off, but even he hadn't expected this. The woman Richard had mocked was not only a soldier. She was an officer trusted enough to infiltrate his circle unnoticed. Richard tried to recover, raising his chin in defiance. "A badge means nothing," he snapped, though his voice trembled. "You think you can challenge me with a piece of metal?" But his words rang hollow, his authority slipping further with each syllable. Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she removed her plain jacket in one deliberate motion, revealing a crisp uniform beneath. The hall erupted in shouts and gasps. The disguise was gone. She stood tall, no longer invisible, but undeniable. The transformation was more than visual. It was symbolic. Elena had shifted from shadow to light, from silence to voice. The audience, once entertained by her humiliation, now hung on her every move. Even those loyal to Richard could not mask their unease. Power had changed hands without force, without violence, only through truth unveiled. Richard's eyes darted around, searching for support, but he found only wary stares and whispered doubts. Elena took a step forward, closing the space Richard had used to intimidate her. Her voice, calm yet unyielding, filled the hall. "You mock me for weakness," she said, her eyes locked on his. "But weakness isn't silence. It's arrogance. And tonight, arrogance ends." Her words struck harder than any shout, echoing in the stunned silence. Richard's face flushed, his fists clenched, but he could not find an answer. The hall no longer belonged to him. Every eye followed Elena. Every breath hung on what she might say next. Richard had been the predator, but now he looked cornered, exposed. The clerk he mocked had unmasked herself, and in doing so, had stripped him bare. What would she reveal next? The question burned in every mind, leaving the hall trembling on the edge of the storm that was about to break. Elena held the files firmly against her chest. The same papers Richard had mocked only moments before. With deliberate calm, she opened them, revealing pages stamped with the insignia of classified government documents. The hall erupted in whispers as she raised one sheet high enough for front rows to see. "These," she said evenly, "are records of decisions made in this very office. Decisions that cost lives while protecting only one man's career." Her words landed like detonations, each syllable cutting through Richard's crumbling facade. Richard lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers from her hands, but Elena sidestepped with trained precision. "Sit down, Mr. Secretary," she commanded, her voice sharper than any gavel. The authority in her tone was unmistakable. Gasps filled the hall as he froze, his hands suspended mid-air. For the first time, Richard Alden, master of intimidation, was immobilized, not by force, but by the weight of truth made visible. The cameras caught every second, broadcasting his humiliation to the world. She continued, flipping through the file. hidden contracts, unauthorized operations, lives lost under your orders, all buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence. Each revelation struck harder than the last, the audience recoiling with every word. Journalists scribbled furiously, some already whispering headlines. General Hale's jaw tightened as he exchanged a look with fellow officers. The evidence was damning. Richard wasn't simply arrogant. He was guilty. Richard tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow, desperate. These are lies. Forgeries. His voice cracked, betraying his fear. But Elena remained steady, her gaze unflinching. Then why? She asked, raising another document. Do these files bear your signature? She turned the page toward the audience, and the bold ink glared back at him like confession. A collective gasp swept the hall. Richard stumbled back, his hands trembling, his denial unraveling into silence. Elena stepped forward again, each movement deliberate, each word sharpened to pierce. Power is not proven by how loudly you speak or how many people you can humiliate. Power is proven by truth, and tonight, truth demands that you answer. Richard's knees buckled slightly, sweat dripping down his temple. The crowd leaned in breathless, sensing the climax of the confrontation. For the first time, Richard Alden was not commanding the room. He was its prisoner. The weight of silence pressed on him as Elena closed the file and let the sound of the snap echo across the chamber. "Kneel," she said softly, but the command struck like thunder. The word didn't need volume. It carried the inevitability of justice. Richard's face twisted in rage, then despair, as his legs gave way. He collapsed onto his knees before the woman he had ridiculed. The cameras capturing the moment from every angle. The hall erupted, not in laughter, but in stunned disbelief. Journalists shouted over one another, flashes exploding like fireworks as the most powerful man in the room knelt in disgrace. Some officers turned away in shame, while others stared in awe at the clerk-turned-soldier who had dismantled their leader without firing a single shot. Elena stood tall above him, her presence commanding, her silence now heavier than his speeches had ever been. In that instant, she was no longer invisible, she was unstoppable. Richard bowed his head, broken, his voice barely a whisper. "Please stop." Elena's gaze softened only slightly, but she did not relent. "This is not about me," she declared, addressing the hall. "It's about every soldier who has ever been silenced, every voice crushed under arrogance. Tonight the silence ends." Her words reverberated through the hall, sealing his downfall. The Secretary of Defense had mocked the clerk, but a soldier had risen in her place and shattered him before the world. The hall remained frozen in the aftermath of Richard's collapse, his knees pressed against the marble floor that had once echoed his authority. His hands trembled as he struggled to lift his head, but every camera, every pen, every eye was fixed on his humiliation. Elena stood above him, steady as stone, her uniform now undeniable proof of who she was. The same officials who had laughed moments ago now sat stiff, their faces pale, as if witnessing the crumbling of an empire. The silence was deafening, but it carried with it a collective realization. Power had shifted. Richard's voice broke through the air in a cracked whisper. "You will regret this," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Elena bent slightly, her eyes locking onto his with calm intensity. "Regret belongs to those who chose arrogance over duty," she replied. Her words weren't shouted, but their impact reverberated like gunfire. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet hers, his body shrinking under the weight of the truth she had unleashed. For the first time in his career, Richard Alden was small. The audience erupted, not with cheers, but with shocked murmurs that grew into a wave of noise. Journalists shouted questions. Officers argued in low tones, and the hall boiled with energy that no one could contain. Yet in the middle of the chaos, Elena remained motionless, her authority radiating stronger than any title could grant. Her silence was no longer resistance. It was command. Richard had lost more than his dignity. He had lost control of the narrative, and once gone, it could never be reclaimed. General Hale rose slowly from his seat, his voice firm as he addressed the hall. "The Secretary has betrayed the trust of this office," he declared. His words struck like a verdict, drawing nods from officers who had once looked to Richard for guidance. Elena turned slightly toward Hale, acknowledging his statement but offering no comment. She didn't need to. The room itself had already delivered judgment, and Hale was simply giving it a voice. Richard's empire had crumbled in the span of minutes. Richard's hands clawed at the podium as he tried to rise, but his body betrayed him, heavy with disgrace. The cameras captured every desperate movement, magnifying his downfall for the world to see. Elena stepped forward, her boots clicking against the marble with quiet authority. "Stay down," she said softly, not as a threat, but as a command already fulfilled. Richard froze, his body obeying even as his pride screamed against it. The man who had mocked her was now chained by her words. The hall grew restless, and for a moment it seemed as though the chaos might spiral. But Elena raised a single hand, and the room fell silent. No one questioned her authority. She spoke clearly, each word deliberate. "This is not just about one man," she said, scanning the crowd. "It is about what happens when arrogance blinds leadership, when silence is demanded instead of truth." Her gaze swept the rows of officers and journalists, and for the first time, none dared to look away. Richard slumped forward, his shoulders sagging, a broken man before the very people who once bowed to him. Elena stood above him, not with gloating but with solemnity. "Let this moment serve as a reminder," she said, her voice steady. "Justice does not wear a crown, nor does it sit behind a podium. Justice comes from those who refuse to bow, even when mocked, even when underestimated." The words carried beyond the hall, etched into the memory of everyone present. As security officers finally moved toward Richard, his defeat was sealed. Elena stepped back, allowing the weight of his disgrace to settle. She had not shouted, she had not struck, yet she had toppled the highest authority in the room. The journalists captured the image that would flood headlines. Richard on his knees, Elena standing tall, a single file clutched in her hand like a weapon of truth. It was more than a scene, it was a reckoning. The hall erupted once more, but this time in applause, not mockery. Elena allowed herself one final glance at Richard before turning toward the audience. "Tonight," she said. Silence was broken. Her words echoed as she exited the hall, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence and awakened courage. Justice had been delivered, and arrogance had fallen. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. More powerful stories like this are already on the way. Stories where arrogance is shattered and truth prevails. And if you want to support our work even further, consider becoming a channel member. Together, we'll keep bringing you the most gripping stories of justice and redemption.